Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about the Krill, who were one of the many alien species that we saw in the Orville, and they were the main antagonist, the main enemy of the Union of Planets that Earth is a member of. And the Krill were a society which is very religious, and they believe themselves to be superior to all other species. They think they're the only one with a soul, and all other life in the universe are soulless, and they have the religious duty to conquer the universe for the sake of their god Avis. And so they're in a perpetual holy war against all other species, basically. So they're very aggressive. And I think they were obviously inspired by all kinds of previous villains in older science fiction shows, such as the Jem'Hadar in Deep Space Nine, that were also very physically similar to them. And the Jem'Hadar were also worshipping their gods, who were the founders and willing to die for them, and they want to go into battle to die. And one of the differences is that the Krill are very sensitive to sunlight, because on their own planet it's eternal darkness because it's so cloudy. And so whenever they go around some other planet, they have to wear special suits to protect themselves from the sunlight, and so at least they have a weakness. And I think the name of this species was probably inspired by one of the villains in the old movie called The Last Starfighter, which had an alien villain whose name was Commander Krill. And he was also very similar to the Krill in the Orville, especially his chin, who had like spikes in it. And so the Krill in the Orville are also similar, and so I think that's probably not a coincidence. It's also similar to the villain in Galaxy Quest, whose name was General Saris. So obviously a lot of the previous stuff inspired what we see in the Orville, so it's kind of a homage to all of that. And the way they show the Krill culture, it's also kind of similar to the Klingons, who kind of live for war, they want to die in battle. Even though in the Klingon case it was more about a cultural thing, it was not so religious. And so the Krill actually reminds me of all kinds of things from reality, of all kinds of groups of people who want to wage holy war because they think they will go to heaven if they die in that war. They think it's their religious duty to kill or convert all other people into their religion and to take over, because that's their fanatical ideology. Which is a real problem, because you cannot actually make peace with such people, and you cannot even scare them because they want to die, they want to go into battle and die in it, and so it's really hard to deter such people. And so that's what was shown in the Orville as well, that the Krill are willing to sacrifice anything. They would sacrifice their own children for the sake of their victory, and they want to simply kill you and destroy you, and it's impossible to negotiate a peace with them. So in some ways it's like the perfect villain species for a show like Star Trek or the Orville, since they want to show that humanity on Earth is evolved and enlightened and peaceful and solved all the problems. And so if it's so peaceful, how come it's fighting so many wars around the galaxy? So the only way to explain it logically is by showing that the enemy is simply so illogical, because the enemy is so fanatical and religious and loves war. And so even though they're technologically advanced on the same level, but ideologically they're not the same, and so you have literally no choice but to fight them because they attack you. And that way the show can have the cake and eat it too. They can show humanity being so peaceful and peace-loving, but also have some action scenes at the same time of fighting an evil enemy. So what can you do? Maybe after you defeat them, after you deter them with sheer violence, with sheer force, maybe later on you can make friends with them. Or if there's some bigger enemy and both of them have to join forces together to defeat the bigger enemy, and they save each other. And so that is what all the Star Trek shows often did. They often show that the enemy of the past is your ally in the future, which is also a nice thing to show, but often it was kind of too convenient. Oh, suddenly some bigger enemy shows up, and so both of the older enemies have to unite against it, and so it's not really dealing with the core problems and the core issues of the conflict that preceded it. And so I think I like what the Orville is doing better than Star Trek, because Star Trek often raised all kinds of questions but didn't really delve that deeply into them. I think the Orville is actually doing it better in some ways. For example, showing that the problem with the Krill is mainly because of their religion, and that's what makes them so fanatical and violent and ruthless and all of that. And I think it makes sense. It's also the case in reality, in my opinion, in my personal opinion. I do think religions caused a lot of trouble which could have been avoided. I'm not saying it's the only cause of wars and conflicts. It's not, but it is a big element of it. And it's also something that makes people more willing to go off into war, because if you tell someone, if someone believes that there is no real death, that when he dies he simply goes to heaven, especially if he dies in the name of his god or religion, and so he goes to heaven, and so that gives people the extra motivation to do that kind of thing. If someone knows that his life is the only life he's going to get, so maybe he'll be more worried about losing it, compared to someone who thinks that he's not really going to die, that he's going to be promoted to heaven if he does. And so it makes it more likely for most people to risk their lives on war. So if not for that, if not for religion, maybe people will be treating this life as something more precious to protect, knowing that it's the only one they're going to get. So maybe they'll try harder to avoid the war. So that's my personal opinion. And so I think this whole idea of an enemy which is so religious and fanatical, and that's why it's the enemy of the Federation or / the Union in the Orville, which is so peaceful and enlightened, it makes sense, because if not for that, then why not simply make peace with them? And all of this also fits with Gene Roddenberry's vision, because he was an atheist, and so very often he showed the Federation and Starfleet as being very secular, very kind of almost anti-religious, and always the religious parties were the ones with all the problems that stem from their religion. And I do kind of tend to agree with that. I'm not saying religion is always evil. There is a lot of nice things in all religions, but very often they also cause a lot of problems. And also the fundamental question, is religion actually true or not? In my personal opinion, it's not. I am personally an atheist, and I'm not saying it lightly. I say it after spending a lot of time and effort studying this question and listening to all sides and debating with people for probably thousands of hours, and after pondering this topic for a long time, looking at it from all angles, I do think my personal conclusion is that it's probably not true. Unfortunately, I'm actually kind of hoping that I'm wrong. I actually think if it is true that there is a God and a heaven and an afterlife, it's a really nice idea. That's why so many people want to believe it. I also would want to believe it, because of course it's better than the alternative. If we're all going to die and be gone forever, and probably all of humanity and the entire universe will die eventually, and there will be nothing after that, of course it's a depressing thought. So of course I would rather the alternative to be true. I would rather know that there is some kind of eternal consciousness and some kind of plan that everything will be alright in the end, everything will be good in the end. Of course it's better than the alternative, but just because it sounds better doesn't mean it is true. And so unfortunately, after logically analyzing all of it, in my opinion, it's more likely that it's not true. And I do think truth matters. I wouldn't come to someone who's dying and tell them, oh, there is no afterlife, you're going to be gone forever. Of course, I'm not going to do that. So a white lie is okay sometimes. If a small child is worried about something or is suffering, of course I might lie to him and tell him everything will be perfect and okay later on, even if it's not true. But as adults, if we're seriously going to debate this topic, I do think religion is probably not okay. And we don't have to totally defeat religion to avoid violence. Like if you're going to debate someone, you don't have to totally convince him his religion is completely false. You just have to convince him to take a more enlightened approach. Like, why not highlight those good parts of his own religion and make him follow that instead of the uglier parts? And so you don't have to fully fight religion head on to destroy it. That would be an extremism of the other kind, and so I'm not for that as well. So anyway, what I wanted to say is that I kind of agree with Gene Roddenberry's vision, and I don't hold these opinions because I loved Star Trek or grew up on it. I would have probably reached these conclusions anyway, even if I never heard about this show, but that's one of the reasons I do like it, because I do think it makes sense and it has the correct message. And often they show that some alien can pretend to be a god, and obviously that's a bad thing. Everyone would agree that some alien is simply pretending to be a god to enslave people, like Ardra in TNG, or all kinds of examples like that. Obviously anyone should agree that's bad, that someone is manipulating and lying to people to exploit them. Obviously is a bad thing. Even if you're a religious person, you should agree with that. And so most of these shows had these correct educational messages, you can say, that most people should agree with logically. And so in the case of the Krill in the Orville, obviously it's a villain species who are doing the things they're doing mostly because of their religion, and the religion makes it harder to talk them out of it. So if it's in their own religious text that they have to conquer the universe, then what can you possibly do against them except fight them or try to somehow convince them that their religion is wrong, and that way they will lose that motivation. Another thing that makes Star Trek and the Orville interesting is all those times they raise some kind of moral dilemma, some kind of ethical debate. If they have to do kind of a necessary evil choice, that all options are bad and you have to pick the best one, then what would you do in that situation? It's kind of an interesting intellectual puzzle, which is fun to debate, especially if the line of good or bad is kind of blurry, that you don't exactly know what you would do in that situation. This way we can debate about it literally forever, because it's such a complicated and complex question. If there is no straight right or wrong answer, and a lot of times it has to do with a war. For example, in Deep Space Nine, there were a lot of situations in which you have to do something bad for the greater good. You have to sacrifice something or do something that goes against your own morality because you know it's for the greater good. And so if you don't do it, that things will be even worse. And in TNG there was that episode when they pondered about using the Borg Hugh against the other Borg, even though Hugh became more human, and so it was no longer okay to sacrifice him, and yet the whole future of humanity was at stake. And so would you do such a bad thing? Would you exploit an innocent and sacrifice him? And so there were a lot of all kinds of interesting morality questions like that. And also in Enterprise, Archer had to torture someone once to get some information out of him because he needed to save Earth, and so normally he would never do such a thing, but because the stakes were so high, then that forced him to do it, and he doesn't like to do it, yet he has to. And so I think it's interesting. In some ways, maybe it's not a good thing for a TV show, because a TV show should have educational messages of showing the heroes do the right thing and all of that, so showing them in all these kinds of situations in which they have to become torturers or murderers or sacrificing innocent people, maybe it's not a good thing for a TV show aimed at kids. And a family-friendly TV show maybe should be more simple, in the sense that it should show you the difference between right and wrong and show the heroes do the right thing and all of that. And up until TNG, probably that was the case. The heroes, even if they did have a moral dilemma, they still always did the correct thing, the good thing, despite the risks and all of that. And only in Deep Space Nine and onward they started going darker, which to me, luckily I kind of grew up at exactly the same time as I was watching the shows, and so I watched the more family-friendly shows early on and the darker shows later on, which was perfect in my specific case, in my age. So to me it was more interesting when they went darker and more complex. But if I was a younger kid watching that, probably that would not be so good. So I have some mixed feelings on that. And in the Orville, they had that Krill episode when they have to go undercover on a Krill ship to find out more about them, with the aim of actually making peace with them later on, since they simply need to understand them and they have to get a copy of their Bible. And so they didn't really go to that ship with nefarious purposes, they just wanted to get some intelligence on their potential enemy. But then as they were on that ship, they found out the Krill ship is actually going to attack an Earth colony of 100,000 people and completely destroy it. And at that point they realized they have to stop it. Obviously they have to protect their own colony, and so they found a way to kill all the Krill on that ship to prevent it. But then they found out there are little kids, the Krill kids, on the ship. And I loved how the episode specifically went out of its way to show that the kids are not yet corrupted, they are not yet brainwashed, they are still innocents, they're still curious about humans and all of that, so they're not yet evil. And so it's not as if it's a genetic thing that the Krill are all evil. It's not as if they're born that way. They're indoctrinated into it by their own culture and religion and all of that. And so it was a very important thing to show in the episode, that the kids are pure innocence and pure good-hearted, just like Earth kids are. And so it's not a racist thing. It's not as if the Krill are naturally evil, which means there is the potential for a peace with them someday. So that was a very important thing in that episode. And obviously our heroes had the moral dilemma now of what to do. So they have to save their own colony from these aggressors who want to destroy them, and yet they do not want to kill these innocent kids on the ship. And so they found a way to spare the kids. They managed to keep them safe while they kill only the adults on that ship to save their colony. And I think that was one of the best episodes of the Orville. I love the way that it has a lot of comedy, it has action, and it has this moral dilemma, and it has the heart and the morality of our heroes trying to save the innocents even on the enemy side. I think the episode is perfect as it is because it's for a TV audience, obviously, so we should have, the good, encouraging moral messages and all of that. for a family-friendly show. But if it was taking place in reality, and if there was no simple solution to do what they did to save the kids, obviously if they can, they should do it. But what if there was no such way? On a TV show, there is always that kind of a solution in shows like TNG. So there's always some kind of loophole to get you out of really making the tough call. And so that's why I said in Deep Space Nine and in some episodes of Voyager, it was not as easy and that. And the heroes could not find some easy solution for their moral problem. They had to actually make the tough choice till the end, because there was no way to bypass it. And so what if in the episode of the Orville, there was no way to save the kids? What if they could only stop that attack on their own colony by blowing up the alien ship, and they didn't have any way to save the kids on that ship? So would they still do it or not? Obviously, if they have to save 100,000 innocent people of their own side, obviously they would have to still do it. They will feel bad for it. They will feel bad for all those kids of the Krill dying. But whose fault would it be really? Isn't it the fault of the Krill leaders who sent that ship to attack and destroy the Earth colony for no reason? So shouldn't they be to blame for any deaths that is caused by that? So obviously the heroes should try to spare those kids if they can. But what if they cannot? What if there is no way to do that easily? So should they simply sacrifice their own colony with their own innocent children on it? Or should they do whatever it takes to stop it? So obviously it would be a much more dark episodes if they do have to kill all those kids to save their own colony. But if there is literally no other choice, I don't think anyone can blame them if they had to do it. And maybe we can make it more interesting by changing the proportions. Maybe if we say the Krill ship is actually huge and it has like 1,000 children on board, and yet that Earth colony is really small and it has only 500 children there. So what would they do then? Would they sacrifice 1,000 innocent children of the Krill to save only 500 children on the Earth colony? So would they still do that choice or not? So that makes it more blurry, that makes it more difficult to answer. But I would still say the answer would be yes, because the Krill are the aggressors, they're the ones attacking, they're the ones causing all of this in the first place. And so because of that, that still means you have to do it, you have no choice. If you are on the side of the Union, you have to protect the Union citizens first. Even if the enemy brought their own children on their attack ship, should that make them immune from stopping that ship? If you cannot stop it in any other way except blowing it up, then should you sacrifice your own kids on your own colony? I don't think so. And also, if you do not do it, what message would that send to the Krill leadership? Like, if the Krill leadership realize, oh, they didn't stop our own attack ship from destroying their colony because we had a bunch of kids there, and they value the lives of our kids more than we do, so let's always do that. Let's put children and babies on every single warship we send against them, and then the enemy will not be able to stop us, because they'll be worried about the safety of our own kids, which we put on our attack ships, and they'll always try to spare them. They'll always try to only disable the ships and not destroy them, and that will make us superior. That will make it easier for us to attack the Union, because the Union values the lives of our children more than us. And so that will turn it into like a strategy. They will always be doing that, and in ever increasing numbers. Once they realize that's your weakness, that you want to spare the lives of their children, then they'll deliberately put their children on every warship they have, so that you will not be able to destroy their warships. So of course it will be outrageous and cynical on the side of the Krill, but if they're on a religious fanaticism holy war, then that's exactly what they'll do. If they think their children go to heaven when they die, since they're so religious and they think it's their holy mission to do this war, then that's exactly what they'll do. And then the Union will be powerless. The Union will say, oh, it's against the law to harm innocent civilians, and so since there are more innocent children on their attack ships than on the colonies they're attacking, then therefore we'll not attack their ships and will allow them to blow up our colonies. So that will be outrageous, obviously. And I know that, in real life it's not as simple as that. It's always more complex. There are always more sides to it. It's not so black and white as I presented it here. But I still wanted to talk about this basic moral dilemma, that it is important who is the aggressor and who is not. Who is the one trying to make peace and who is the one who doesn't want peace. So that is a big part of the morality of war. And so if the Krill side wants war, and it's the one that is initiating it, and it's the one that doesn't care about its own children, and you are the one protecting yourself against them, and just because they have more kids that they put on their own attack ships, as they're going to attack your kids, does that mean you are not allowed to protect your own kids if you have less kids on your side getting hurt? So you should not be allowed to fire back at their ships. And so I think you get what I'm getting at, that you have to look at the big picture to really get what's going on. And again, maybe I'm oversimplifying things, and in reality, it's never this black and white. And of course, proportionality should be taken into account. If the colony they're attacking only has like 5 people and 1 kid, and yet their ship has a million kids on it, so maybe that will give me pause. Maybe I will sacrifice the 1 kid on the planet to spare the million kids on the enemy ship, even though it is the aggressor. And who is the aggressor is important, and also you have to think for the future, because once you make that decision the first time that, oh, I will not harm any kids on the enemy side, and the enemy realizes that, and then they will exploit it against you, and then the situation will get worse and worse and worse. So you have to put a line somewhere. You cannot allow this to keep happening. Sometimes you have to make the tough choice if it means better results in the long term or in the big picture. You know, just like in that TNG episode when Data decides to kill Fajo because Fajo is threatening Data that he will kill his own people if he will not obey him. And he killed 1 woman in front of him and says, I will kill more people as long as you not obey me and be my slave. And Data decides to simply kill him, which he normally would never do because he's not a murderer. It's against his ethical programming. Yet he still decides to do it because he says, I cannot allow this to continue. Because once he surrenders, then Fajo wins, and so evil will win. And so sometimes you do have to make the tough call if it's for the greater good, for the big picture, or the long term. And so you cannot allow a cynical way of an enemy exploiting its own civilians against you because of your morality. You cannot allow it to work because then the enemy will win and the enemy is an evil one. And I'm not saying that means you should totally disregard innocent lives, and so because the enemy is guilty, so you can just do whatever you want. No, I'm not saying that. You should still try to save the innocents as much as you can, obviously. I'm just saying it's not always possible, so it all depends on the situation. And I also realize the danger of, once I justify such a thing, the other side can do exactly the same thing. The other side can also say, oh, it's okay to kill civilians for the greater good, and we think that we are doing the greater good, and so we're willing to sacrifice innocents and to attack innocent civilians because it's for the greater good. And so I realize it's a slippery slope. Once I say something like that, the enemy can also be justified using the exact same thing. And so, of course, it's a problem. Of course, it's a complex issue, and it's a very controversial one, and we can argue about it forever. And also, topics like that cannot only be solved logically. We cannot simply say, oh, because if I do this or do that, then I can save 50 people, and if I do this or that, I will only save 20 people, so I'll always pick the bigger numbers, because it's not as simple as that. There is the emotional component as well. It's not just pure logic that people are making decisions by. They often do it out of emotion, and so you obviously favor your own side compared to the side of the enemy because you're more emotionally attached to your own side. And so there are so many factors that go into all of this that it's a really complicated and complex issue. Imagine if it's your own children who get hurt, would you respond to that rationally and logically, or would you respond emotionally? So of course you might respond unproportionately and illogically just out of sheer rage. And so when talking about conflicts and wars, it's not as simply as looking at numbers, how many died on each side or how many got injured. If your enemy kidnaps one of your children and tortures them and mutilates them, that will have an emotional impact that might make you do things even worse to them, but they're the one who started it. So you can get into all kinds of situations that looking from the side, other people might not understand, because they don't get the emotional impact of what your enemy did to you. If they did something sadistic or they did some kind of psychological terror on you, and then you react in what might look like disproportionate response. And also there's the whole blood feud element of it, the cycle of violence. You do something bad to them, and then they do it back to you, and so there's like a revenge cycle. So even if you spare some kids, but you kill their parents, then they'll still be angry with you, and then they grow up and attack you and your kids. And so there are so many moving parts in such a puzzle that it's not something as simple as what we see in TV shows and movies. And I think many of you realize by now that I'm kind of using all of this as a metaphor to real life events. And if anyone wants to listen to my actual political opinions, I will put a link to a playlist which I have on a different channel than this. I made it a few years ago, and a lot of people wanted to hear my personal political views and all of that, so I didn't want to do it on any of the channels that I do for entertainment. I don't want to put politics into it, and so that's why I made a separate channel just for that, and I have a playlist of videos of my personal opinions, including one which I made recently about recent events, and so I'll put links to it in the end and in the comments. For anyone interested in hearing my opinions about real-life politics and real-life events, then please go to that channel. I do not want to do it on this one, because this one is about movie and TV reviews and science fiction and things like that. And so I want to keep it clean from politics, which are obviously much more complicated and dirty and controversial compared to the things I talk about on this channel. So that's it for now, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.